Marriage separation is never an easy thing to accept. And sometimes we think the worst of our partners as we're going through this, and one of those things can lead to the suspicion that they are hiding assets, misusing funds through the use of trusts. And here today, we're here today to talk with Brian Pashen and Morais about busting the trust. Welcome, everybody.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley.
So I believe Brian and Montana have got a 7-step plan that they're going to be able to walk you through today that will show you exactly what you need to do and the steps you need to take to uncover whether there is any, let's call it unscrupulous, trust activity in a relationship that is devoid of trust. Brian, over to you for step 1. What's the first thing that you would do?
Well, what we need to determine is who is involved. Obviously, it's the other partner, and also what is involved, the trust, the type of trust, and what information we have about that trust.
Okay. And Montana?
Yeah, I agree. Definitely the first step is to identify who's involved. So obviously we have the parties going through the separation. We've got the lawyers acting for them. Often the accountant's a really important person in this process. And then sometimes there might be a trustee who's not a party to the marriage. So that's obviously another person that's involved. Sometimes the beneficiaries of the trust. So we need to identify all the relevant parties that are involved in this particular issue.
Yeah, okay, so it's a bit of an exercise in widening the net. You know, a couple are getting divorced. It's probably not a bad idea to look beyond that immediate relationship and look to other family members like mum, dad, or an auntie or an uncle that may be a controlling influence in a trust. Is that what you're saying, Montana?
Yeah, absolutely. Or sometimes it's the other way around. So it might be that elderly mother is the trustee of a trust, but in fact it's the husband who's separating from his wife that's controlling that. So while elderly mum mightn't know that she's a party to this, she obviously ends up a party to not necessarily the proceedings, but just the issue that we're trying to resolve.
Yeah, so obviously a good place to start is to work out all the interested parties. And then that moves us on to step 2, Brian.
Yes, well, we need to determine in regard to the trust itself, who the trustees are, who the beneficiaries are. We need to get details of the trust deed, financials, tax returns, that sort of thing.
Absolutely, and dates like when was the trust set up and how long has it been operating. I'm pretty sure that would be important consideration.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Time of when it was set up, any changes of trustees, the timing of that, deeds of variation which may change entitlements, that sort of thing is very relevant.
A very factual examination there. And Montana, for you?
Yeah, definitely. So to determine the facts, as Brian said, we probably need some documents, so the original trust deed and any variations to that deed along the way. Determining how it actually runs. So I sort of alluded to it before, there might be a trustee, but they mightn't be the one that's actually controlling the trust. So we need to determine all of the facts of basically historically looking at how the trust is operated and, as Brian said, asking for financials and tax returns and things like that. So that will assist us in determining all the facts so that we know exactly what really our issue is.
Absolutely. So I guess steps 1 and 2 are a bit like throwing all the jigsaw puzzles out on the table. So we've got all the pieces, and our next step, I suppose, is to say, hey, what does the final picture look like? So I believe this is the step, Brian, you ask the client, what does success look like? What's the objective for you, and what would that be in this case?
Well, exactly, Ashley. What you need to do is determine in regard to the trust, what assets are relevant and what entitlements the party would have to those assets within the trust, and look at that in regard to any property settlement.
Okay. Montana?
Yeah, certainly, and that would be Brian's role in this, so we would rely on the accountant heavily for that sort of information. The objective, obviously, from the family law side of things is to, well, bust the trust. So if I act for a party, for example, for a wife, and the objective is to uncover assets that might be hidden in a trust or uncover a trust that the husband might be saying is not included in any family law settlement, it's really important at that step to confirm what our actual objective is. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess make sure they don't get away with anything that they're not supposed to.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so once we've done that and we've established, you know, the who is involved and all of the facts around it and what the outcome will look like for the client, I guess you would say, well, why doesn't everybody do it? And that's because there's obviously obstacles in the way. Brian, what are some of the obstacles that you would encounter when you go to discovering how these trusts are set up?
Well, probably the main one would be uncooperative parties or party to the proposals that you're putting that the trust is part of the property, or the assets of the trust are part of the property.
Yep.
So it comes down to uncooperativeness, I suppose, if that's a word.
Yep.
And complete non-disclosure in the first place.
Okay. And Montana, from your perspective?
Absolutely, I agree. That's the single biggest obstacle that we observe. So in the example I gave before, we might be saying to the husband, hey, can you give us some disclosure about this trust? We want to see a copy of the trust deed, or we want to see a copy of the financials. Often what we'll get back from him is, no, I'm not a trustee and I haven't received any distributions from the trust in however many years it might be, and there's just a complete denial to hand over the assets. And so that is often the biggest obstacle that we see, trying to firstly get the disclosure that enables us to review it and move forward.
And as we know in life, not all obstacles are insurmountable. So it's obviously we break these obstacles down into minute pieces. So Brian, how would you overcome this reluctance or this complete non-disclosure of a trust? What are some of the steps that you would take?
Well, some of the areas you can do searches externally, like with ASIC in regard to companies, the directors and shareholders, to see if there's any relatives or family that may have an interest in a company or that's trustee of the trust, and look at it that way so you can determine whether there are trusts in existence, and also through tax returns and financials, see if there's been any distributions to the party that you're involved with or the other parties, and through that determine whether the trust is in existence.
And so Montana, from your perspective, what do you do?
Absolutely, I agree with what Brian's just said, and as you say, you've got to narrow down the obstacles. So obviously the first one is, well, does the trust exist? So we would do the things that Brian's just suggested, and once we know that and we've got over that obstacle, then we can move on to the next one.
Absolutely. So, and in your case, that might be, yes, there is some involvement in a trust somewhere, and I suspect at that stage you have an opportunity to invoke some of your legal powers to get disclosure?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, firstly, we'll call for it from the other party, and if it's not forthcoming, we might go around them and ask the accountant. Quite often the accountant will have the relationship with that party, so they might not be willing to give it over to us. And as we've discussed before, as a last resort, if we have to issue subpoenas, then that's what we have to do.
Look, that's been really helpful today because it is a cloudy issue. It's full of emotion. It's full of perceived deception, and it's odd to think that the business entity is called a trust when the very thing that it seems to be doing is eroding trust. But here today, you've seen these two professional people talk about simple step-by-step guides that if you have a suspicion that your partner may be using a trust and it's not to your advantage, then if you do the step-by-step list that Brian and Montana have talked about, it will certainly leave you in a better frame of mind. So thanks for watching today, and thanks Brian and Montana for joining us. Helpful as always.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley.